In 1611, Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory was put under house arrest at Castle Chita for murdering some 650 young women. Before then, she had been one of the most powerful women in Hungary, a widow controlling vast territory. In her trial, 289 witnesses testified against her, and 4 of her associates were convicted and executed for their crimes. Because of her noble rank, however, she was allowed to live the rest of her life under house arrest until she died at the age of 54 in 1614. Her crimes have become the stuff of legends and nightmares. She was said to have used torture methods like the Iron Maiden, deriving sexual pleasure from the women's deaths, and in the decades that followed, Hungarian folklore told of the Blood Countess, who supposedly bathed in the blood of these young virgins to keep herself youthful. Bathory is one of the most well-known female serial killers in history, even holding an inexplicable Guinness World Record for being the most prolific female serial killer. She's said to have inspired many characters in literature and media, and even the trope of lesbian vampirism. What is lesbian vampirism? Part 1. The Origins. As vampire literature took hold in the 19th century, a peculiar trend emerged in the way female vampires were presented. They were pretty gay, targeting young, attractive women. Many scholars like Jameson Ridenauer agree that this all started with the OG lesbian vampire story, Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 Carmilla. While there was a lot of empiric literature before then, even some queer vampire stories like Christabel and some Irish fairy traditions, Carmilla was the first to introduce queer eroticism into the unsuspecting English literary scene, using the bite of a vampire as a twisted sexual kiss. Carmilla is probably the most important work in the entire trope, inspiring dozens of movies, books, and other adaptations directly, and indirectly creating an explosion of similar narratives. So, what about Carmilla has been so persevering? Part 2. Carmilla. The novel is narrated by Laura, a lonely and isolated girl living alone with her father in rural Austria. A beautiful and mysterious woman of about Laura's age, Carmilla, is invited to stay with her and her father after the mysterious death of Laura's friend. And while Laura and Carmilla begin to grow closer, Laura's health seriously deteriorates, and Carmilla makes strange proclamations about both death and an intense love for Laura. Eventually, it's discovered that Carmilla is a vampire from the ancient Karnstein family, responsible for the death of Laura's friend, and soon to be Laura's unless she's stopped. Laura's father, Laura's friend's father, Laura's doctor, this random guy, Baron Fordenberg, and some other suddenly appearing men assemble and kill Carmilla by staking and decapitating her, freeing Laura from her influence. The first thing to mention about the original Carmilla is how insufferably boring Laura is. She's unbelievably blind to any plot development, relying on everyone else around her to figure it out. There's even a moment when Laura hears a voice say, "Your mother warns you to beware of the assassin," accompanied by a vision of Carmilla covered in blood. Laura's response? "I awakened with a shriek, possessed with the one idea that Carmilla was being murdered." So, until she becomes relevant in later adaptations, let's leave Laura behind. Carmilla, however, is much more interesting, at least superficially. There's the queer woman's urge to instantly heroize her as she's a certified bad bitch who unquestionably slays. Laura, throughout the book, is evidently smitten with Carmilla, often to her own dismay, admitting that even though she was afraid of Carmilla's strange behavior, she also feels a strange and tumultuous excitement that was pleasurable, and evident euphemism for arousal. Carmilla is also persecuted, but several times manages to outwit the men around her. For much of the book, she's just winning, a powerful queer woman who does what she wants and is good at what she does. Despite all of this, we need to be careful, as Carmilla, the narrative, is carefully constructed to present women's attraction to one another as a threat that heterosexual men can and must eradicate. Part 3. Why is Carmilla? The first explicit vampire in English literature was Lord Ruthven from John Polidori's 1819 The Vampire, which began many of the motifs in vampire literature that continue to this day. The Vampire is the first work to explicitly tie the drinking of blood to a sexual act, with its main character, Lord Ruthven, a cold, aristocratic seducer preying on young, innocent women. Vampire literature is often preoccupied with the corruption of innocence, and you can see this continued in Carmilla. Interestingly, Carmilla kills off peasant women in the nearby town without ceremony in a single feast. But for Laura and her friend Bertha, Carmilla enters into some type of intrigue with them, and seems to play elaborate games of seduction with her prey. Le Fanu, then, takes class themes from earlier vampire literature, but adds his own complications with gender and sexuality. So, knowing this, how does the story basically function? Laura is virginal, innocent, and passive, and therefore has no real role in the original story. Instead, Laura narrates how other people compete over her fate. There's Laura's father, who seeks to protect her, as well as Bertha's father and Baron Fordenberg, and Carmilla, who wants to possess Laura. Laura's really caught between these two extremes, the men in her life trying to maintain the status quo, and a sexy vampire lady she's attracted to. In the original text, there's no question of which of these two is good and which is evil. Surprise, the gay one is evil. But even though Le Fanu's verdict is unambiguous, we'll get to that, the story itself isn't without its romance, with moments like this that are almost tender. Carmilla drew her arm closer about my waist, and I let her pretty head sink upon my shoulder. "How romantic you are, Carmilla," I said. "Whenever you tell me your story, it will be made chiefly of some one great romance." She kissed me silently. "I am sure, Carmilla, that you've been in love, that there is, at this moment, an affair of the heart going on." "I have been in love with no one, and never shall," she whispered, "unless it should be with you." Laura, too, is desperate to protect Carmilla at points, and even after she discovers Carmilla's true identity and intentions, she still struggles to reconcile the playful, languid, beautiful girl with the monster she apparently was. And of course, queer eroticism is abundant in the text. But the queer attraction and the relationship behind it is parasitic. Carmilla, and in most narratives about lesbians that are not made recently, lesbianism is about a dominant woman feeding on a weaker one. Carmilla and Laura's relationship has incestuous and predatory elements which should not be ignored, even with the urge to root for Carmilla. Carmilla first appears to Laura in the dead of night when Laura is only 6 years old and assaults her. Laura says of this, "I looked at her with a kind of pleased wonder. She caressed me with her hands and lay down beside me in bed and drew me towards her, smiling. I felt immediately delightfully soothed and fell asleep again. I was wakened by a sensation of 2 needles ran into my breast very deep at the same moment, and I cried loudly." In this scene, we can see 2 elements on display: a maternal-like care of Laura and a sexual predation on her. Their relationship becomes extra creepy when it's revealed that Laura's mother is descended from the Karnstein family, making Carmilla a relative of Laura's, who's taking on a maternal and sexual role in Laura's life. Queerness, represented by Carmilla in this context, is poisonous and infectious. When Carmilla kills local women in the town, it's called a plague, but the reader knows it's actually just a queer woman who's infecting others and killing them. Rather than presenting relationships between women as love, Le Fanu presents them as a contagion that has to be contained. Narratives about lesbians in this context are pretty simple then. An evil gay woman wants to hurt an innocent straight woman, and heteronormativity is restored by men. Part 4. Bathory Revisited. Although pop culture renders Elizabeth Bathory as a sadistic murderer, most scholars agree that she was probably framed and almost certainly never killed anyone. While it's true that around 300 people testified against Elizabeth Bathory, more than 250 offered either hearsay or no information whatsoever. The testimony that Bathory had listed 650 victims was a second-hand accounting of what a court official had discovered, yet the official who'd supposedly seen this information didn't testify. Most of these witnesses were beholden to the leader of the investigation, a royal judge named Gregory Thurzo. Most of the deaths of the young women at the time coincided with local plagues and epidemics. According to Aleksandra Bartosiewicz, a historian and professor of the University of Lodz, the trial against Elizabeth was a spectacle aimed at destroying the power and influence of the Bathorys. The conspiracy was an intricate work of Palatine Thurzo, who took advantage of the moods reflected in Chita. Thurzo and King Matthias II of Hungary, who sent him, had direct motivations for framing Bathory. Matthias II owed a lot of money to Elizabeth after her husband's death, and at the time, the ruler of a land would take some or all of a person's property after they were convicted of murder. By convicting Elizabeth, the king would have enriched himself and gotten rid of his largest single creditor. Bathory was a powerful woman, even more so after the death of her husband. Since a large debt owed by Matthias II to her was cancelled by her family in exchange for letting them manage her captivity, it's pretty likely that the supposed crimes attributed to her were actually just slander that allowed relatives to take her lands and property. So framing Bathory as a perverse, lesbicious serial killer of young women, some of them noble women, allowed the powerful men who wanted her lands and owed her money to rob her of her status and power. And in doing so, we shouldn't forget the 3 innocent people who were murdered by the state for crimes that did not happen. Remember her co-conspirators who were executed? While Elizabeth's class protected her from the worst punishments, 4 of her servants were either burned alive or beheaded. It seems the only people who did murder anyone working for Elizabeth were the men accusing her of doing so. What happened to Elizabeth Bathory shows that a woman who gets too out of line can be labeled as a vicious lesbian and have her power taken away. Narratives about the dangers of queer women and their aristocratic abuse of power and beauty supports real-world narratives about LGBT people. Part 5. Queerness as Monstrosity. This trend doesn't just, or even primarily, apply to women. Framing queerness as monstrous is ubiquitous in Western culture, even surprisingly recently. To turn someone into a monster, you turn them into a homosexual. In Jasbir Puar and Amit Rai's piece, Monster Terrorist F-Slur, they demonstrate how in the wake of 9/11, presenting Osama bin Laden as a monster also involved turning him into a homosexual, with images of him being anally penetrated everywhere in media. In one cartoon, which I know exists but can't seem to find anywhere on the internet, Osama bin Laden is literally anally penetrated by the Empire State Building, with the caption, "The Empire Strikes Back," and "So you like skyscrapers, huh, bitch?" Let's stop for a moment and just think about that image and what it says about American insecurities. It wasn't enough to present Osama bin Laden as a mass murderer, which he was. He also had to be made into a F-slur to become a monster in the eyes of America. And in case this isn't abundantly clear, fuck Osama bin Laden, I'm just trying to demonstrate how even when someone is already a horrible human being, that's not enough. They have to be gay as well. And like our real-world monsters, our allegorical monsters like Carmilla must also be eliminated. And when we want to eliminate someone, even when they're neither a monster nor gay, we make them into both, completing their transition into something that has to be eliminated, like was done to Elizabeth Bathory over 400 years ago. It should also be noted that the racism of America in the wake of 9/11 was honestly shocking as someone who didn't live through it. Puar and Rai note the emasculation of Osama bin Laden is also a direct response to the American fear of itself being emasculated, saying the US was horrified at the image of the castration and penetration of white Western phallic power. The homophobia I'm commenting on shouldn't be discussed without mentioning the racism backing it up. Part 6. Dracula's Daughter and Correction. Carmilla, which started the trend of lesbian vampirism, was about presenting queer women as monsters, but as the genre became more saturated into the 20th century, more complicated vampires emerged. gay people who maybe have hope of being normal, but don't and of course still are monsters. In the 1936 film Dracula's Daughter, we can see a queer vampire who wants to be normal but fails. Our main character in the film is Countess Zaleska, a beautiful foreign woman who is mysteriously overjoyed when Dracula is killed. We later learn that she is Dracula's daughter, and hoping to free herself of being a vampire, ritually destroys Dracula's body. From this moment, Zaleska differs significantly from the female vampires in Carmilla and Bram Stoker's Dracula. She doesn't want to be a monster, but is compelled to be by irresistible urges. Throughout the film, this vampirism can be read as a pretty thinly veiled metaphor for queerness, and its treatment of Zaleska representative of the way queer people were understood at the time. Still a vampire, Zaleska approaches the film's protagonist, renowned psychiatrist Dr. Garth, to ask about curing herself in a pretty clear attempt at self-conversion therapy.
Something that reaches out from beyond the grave and fills me with horrible impulses.
How can I help you?
Use my brain, my will, for an instrument as he has used them, but for release.
Your mind has the power to do that.
No.
Your strength lies within yourself. Put it to a test.
A test?
Now, for example, you know what we do with alcoholics? We give them liquor, make them sit for hours alone without touching it. Make them meet their craving, beat it back. That is, if they have the will to be free.
Basically, if she manifests hard enough, she'll be fine. Despite her attempts to pray the gay away, Zaleska still kills a young woman, Lily, in a moment full of sexual undertones.
You won't object to removing your blouse, will you?
Revealing to the audience that she really can't be helped even when trying to follow Garth's advice and is just a monster. Accepting that she can never be normal, Zaleska kidnaps Garth's fiancé and, in a moment called the longest kiss never filmed, leans over her longingly without kissing her. It's also worth noting that Zaleska, like Carmilla before her, kills lower-class women without ceremony, but engages in much more elaborate games when going after higher-class women. When Garth arrives, Zaleska says he must trade his life for Janet's and become a vampire, but Zaleska is first killed by her own servant and the film soon ends. The character of Zaleska is overall similar to Carmilla in several key ways. She's beautiful, aristocratic, intelligent, and uses those skills to prey on young women. However, Zaleska is seemingly more complicated, as she doesn't want to be a monster at first, seeing herself as cursed and just wants to be normal. But the veil she wears, metaphorically and literally, is lifted, and we see who she really is, a gay woman, and therefore a monster. The term homosexuality itself was coined in 1869 as a disease to be cured. It was labeled as a psychiatric disorder in the DSM until 1973. From the late 1800s to fringe movements today, being LGBTQ has been seen as something to be cured by a psychiatrist, as Zaleska attempts to do to herself. While she couldn't be cured, Zaleska's psychoanalysis was used as a way to justify that she really was a monster. Dracula's Daughter mingles the medicalization of queerness with earlier depictions of queerness as purely monstrosity, marking a cultural transition to the types of conversion therapy that emerged in the 20th century. Part 7. The Male Gaze. Some of Dracula's Daughter plays with lesbian sexuality in a way which might be exciting to a male audience. But this trend didn't truly bloom until the Hays Code, which prevented most explicit depictions of queer people, was lifted. And when it was, a lot of lesbian vampire movies basically became a sea of male-gazy camp horror flicks. A lot of the clips I've been using are from the 1970 movie The Vampire Lovers, which is a surprisingly faithful adaptation of Carmilla with a lot of added girl-on-girl action. This movie, like most of the others of its type in the 70s, uses the same trope we've been seeing for a century. Gay women are poisonous to women and must be eliminated by straight men. However, they then just inject as much female nudity and lesbian fetishization as they could get away with, to appeal to an evidently male-dominated audience of horror fans. As for the plot, this movie inexplicably changes Laura's name to Emma, and Bertha's, Laura's friend, if you remember, to Laura, so I'll be using those names in this section. There are also two added characters, Mademoiselle Perraudot and Carl, Laura's, the dead friend of the protagonist Emma's fiancé. Perraudot is Emma's governess, seduced by Carmilla and becomes her accomplice before Carmilla kills her. And good, knight in shining armor, straight male Carl dramatically chases Carmilla off and saves Emma. YouTuber and icon Verily Bitchy explains how Carl is mostly there to create the bisexual love triangle.
The Vampire Lovers also introduces an interesting dynamic which went on to become the staple of lesbian vampire films and which Weiss calls the bisexual love triangle. This trope features a human couple, a man and a woman, and a lesbian vampire who is here to seduce the woman. The man in this dynamic, which is really more of a V shape than a triangle, represents goodness, the church, family, social order, and the lesbian represents evil and bosom.
So this movie really is a trendsetter in terms of developing new homophobic stereotypes about lesbians. A lot of people who talk about this movie and its sequels mention how revolutionary it was by showing some very explicit female sexuality. This is obviously a big step, but it's also worth noting why this was filmed. Literary critic and scholar Bonnie Zimmerman, in her book Jump Cut, argues that the creators of those images, like the pornographic filmmakers who appeal to male fantasies with scenes of lesbianism, must have felt secure enough in their power and that of their primarily male audience to flirt with lesbianism and female violence against men. So this wasn't media for queer women to feel represented. It's for men to know that they can defeat women seducers of women and get off. Pretty clearly, most lesbian vampire films and media of the 20th century, Dracula's Daughter, The Vampire Lovers, and its sequels, have a pretty clear message. Lesbians can be hot, but are still the same parasitic leeches we've seen ever since 1872's Carmilla. So, as modern, more thoughtful viewers, how do we relate to this? To start, I think it's important to look at the stories and adaptations written by people who understand what they're talking about, who are usually women or queer people. Part 8. Good Stories. When I became interested in this topic, I started reading a lot of non-vampire related literature about women's relationships with one another from the 19th century. One of the most legitimately touching stories I read was Mary Eleanor Wilkins Freeman's short story, Two Friends. Let's start by noticing the title, which is basically the meme subreddit Sappho and Her Friend, such a long-standing euphemism for gay women lovers that it feels like Wilkins is winking at me from history. The story itself consists of two middle-aged women who live together, Abby and Sarah. Abby is dying, and her lifelong friend Sarah has something to admit. When the two were young, Abby had a suitor, John, that her mother didn't approve of. But as Abby's mother was dying, Sarah was supposed to deliver her last message. Abby was free to marry John. But Sarah never told Abby, afraid of losing her. And decades later, as Abby is dying, Sarah admits what she did, and suddenly Abby starts laughing, saying that she would never have married John and would always have chosen to stay with Sarah. I think media like this, hopefully more contemporary and willing to use a word other than friends, is the gold standard for media to claim. The story is just so genuine and sweet and not homophobic that it absolutely melts my heart every time I read it. So while it's tempting to just look at really famous stories like Carmilla, it's also important to keep your eye out for smaller, more obscure literature. Reading Carmilla, even though it's much more sexual and explicitly queer than a story like Two Friends, isn't really as fulfilling to me because it's not a queer romance. It's a man's idea of a queer romance. However, in a world saturated with and fascinated by the Carmillas, how do we relate to it? My personal reclamation of Eugénie Danglars. There are some stories where you can still love and relate to characters hidden behind the homophobic writing. This approach interprets and reads the story beyond what the author intended. For example, there's a character in Alexander Dumas' 1844 The Count of Monte Cristo who doesn't get nearly enough attention. Eugenie Danglars is a beautiful young woman, described as erudite and masculine, who has a distaste for men but a strong appreciation for feminine beauty. She and her best friend, Louise d'Army, often practice music together on the same piano bench and spend a lot of time in Eugenie's bedroom. Fleeing an arranged marriage, Eugenie cross-dresses and runs away with Louise. However, the two are discovered in bed together at an inn before they can make it to Italy and are forced to walk through a crowd of whispering passers-by. Dumas describes the scene like this. "Oh, why is not the world a wilderness?" she exclaimed, throwing herself into the arms of Mademoiselle d'Army, her eyes sparkling with the same kind of rage which made Nero wish that the Roman world had but one neck, that he might sever it in a single blow. Now, I read this and instantly love Eugenie, but Dumas portrays her as a bitter, angry, mannish lesbian who is, in his words, abducting Louise, who doesn't seem to feel like she's being abducted to me. To him, she's a beast, not womanly or virtuous like he expects women to be, with a type of Nero-like rage his ideal woman would never experience. But to me, this moment, and Eugenie's character more broadly, is so beautiful and heartbreaking. It's a tragic moment when two lovers realize that their relationship is considered an abomination, falling into each other's arms. Even though Dumas wrote this to make fun of lesbians, it's not his story anymore. It's mine, and I love it. That leads us to the third and most drastic approach to relating to this media, making your own adaptation of it. In recent years, the lesbian vampire genre has been reclaimed by women and queer people. Even a story like Carmilla, with a character as boring as Laura and as perverted as Carmilla, has been reclaimed in so many ways, but I want to focus on one particular adaptation which both broke my heart and made me determined to write this project. Let's talk about Carmilla 2019. Conclusion: Transformation and Carmilla 2019. Carmilla 2019 finally gives depth to Laura, or in this film, Lara. Instead of the idyllic domestic paradise described in the novella, Lara struggles with a pretty absent father and a controlling and superstitious governess, Miss Fontaine, who beats Laura and often binds her left hand behind her back, believing it's a mark of Satan. Miss Fontaine is a fascinating character. She's adapted from Mademoiselle de La Fontaine in the novella, an unimportantly worldly French governess. But in this story, Fontaine is a strict, superstitious woman haunted by past sins, repressing her and Lara's sexuality as penance. In one scene, Fontaine warns Laura about a feeling she once had about a person in her youth, warning Laura not to make the same mistakes.
Looking back, I now know what that feeling was. It was excitement. That's all. But I wish I'd known that then. Don't confuse your feelings, Lara. Don't make the same mistakes I did.
We have a hint as to who Fontaine's mistake might have been, as she has sex with the doctor trying to treat Laura before scheming with him to murder Carmilla. The film has the same basic plot as the original novella. Laura's friend, this time named Charlotte, falls ill, but doesn't die until later in the text, unlike in the original, and a mysterious accident brings Carmilla to the house. Except this time, Carmilla isn't a vampire. She isn't even noble, claiming not to remember anything from before the accident, even asking Laura to name her. In this way, Carmilla forges an identity with Laura, when the two share it as they discover their sexualities. The two girls do drink each other's blood, but only as a way of becoming blood sisters, a flirtation purely of this realm. Fontaine can see this attraction, and finally she catches the two girls kissing after exchanging blood, and concludes that Carmilla is a vampire. Soon after this, Laura becomes mysteriously ill, further convincing Fontaine and others that Carmilla has to die. The staking scene is very different in this version. After Laura sees Fontaine beating Carmilla, she runs in, allowing the two to escape, and they run away together. Eventually, exhausted, they fall asleep in one another's arms in a sunny field, when Fontaine, the doctor, the stable boy, and Laura's father find them, separate them, and Fontaine brutally drives a stake into Carmilla's heart, killing her in front of Laura, who screams at them to stop. In the original Carmilla, and in most adaptations like The Vampire Lovers, Carmilla is killed in the dead of night at the ruins of an ancient castle. There, she's a creature of darkness and death, surrounded by it. But Carmilla 2019 moves this into a beautiful meadow, and by doing so, takes Carmilla and her queerness out of the shadows and into the light, and shows the brutality of what must have been done to this young woman. The staking isn't a righteous rescue of Laura, it's the brutal and tragic murder of a young woman. And Fontaine, the only woman in the hunting party, leads the charge against Carmilla and even delivers the final blow. This only makes the story more complex. Fontaine kills Carmilla because she regrets her own demons, which she hypocritically gives into. It's a twisted, parasitic, maternal relationship, reminiscent of the original novella's presentation of Carmilla. Perhaps the only one vampirically feeding on and living through Laura was Fontaine through her religious obsession with destroying Laura's queerness. In her attempt to destroy a vampire which never existed, Fontaine created one in herself. Watching Carmilla 2019 as a piece of media made by a woman authentically representing women's relationships is so fulfilling, but sad. I finally feel like Laura and Carmilla's relationship is meaningful, and to see it so brutally severed is heart-wrenching, even as someone who watches a lot of horror films. But I'm glad Emily Harris, the director, didn't change the ending, and I'm glad she didn't make Carmilla a vampire. Carmilla once existed to show how it was necessary to kill a queer woman, good even, and Harris adapted it to show the true undercurrent of homophobia and fear behind the original story. The way I see it, you have 3 ways to make sense of literature which presents queer people as monsters. You can avoid it and instead read stories like Two Friends. You can read past it and find the person hidden in the writing, like My Journey with Eugenie Danglars, or you can make your own adaptation and bring new life to a story. But whatever you do, know that stories written by dead people don't belong to anyone but you. Make them yours.